And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. That's a fairly optimistic twist on the story, because not only is it Noah, but he gets to save his whole family and down a couple of generations. And so that's a good thing to think about. It's like, as things, I had this client, and she had a very hard upbringing, I would say. Not a lot of encouragement, to say the least. Let's say a fair bit of discouragement. And she had a son, and what was really interesting about her in relationship to her son is that all the things that she could have learned to do to him, given her extensive experience with being made as miserable as possible by someone who was hell-bent on bringing her to her knees, she refused to do to her son. Right? She learned the opposite lesson from all her misery and torment, which was not to move that forward down the generations. And so the idea here is that if you walk properly and aim properly and act properly, if you walk with God in the manner that we've been discussing, is that perhaps that isn't only good for you, perhaps it's also the thing that will save your family. And then by implication, perhaps save society. Because that's exactly what happens with Noah, right? First it's him, and then it's his family, but everything else goes. And so, by saving himself, by acting properly, and by saving his family, he actually saves the world. It's interesting, like the most profound people that I've read who've meditated deeply on the problem, say, of totalitarian catastrophe, and I would put Alexander Solzhenitsyn at the top of that list. His entire corpus, 3 volumes, 700 pages long each, in tiny type, is a long scream about the absolute necessity of individual honesty and ethical behavior as the only bulwark against totalitarian catastrophe. And I've read many writers who've attempted to diagnose the problems of the 20th century. And I think Solzhenitsyn, he came to the same conclusions that Viktor Frankl came to as a consequence of his experiences in the Nazi concentration camps. And Frankl, I'm also an admirer of Frankl, but Solzhenitsyn takes it to an entire different level of profundity and makes an extraordinarily strong case that not only do societies deteriorate because the people within the societies become individually corrupt, but that the only way to stave that off is for the individuals within that society to reject that corruption in the confines of their own personal lives. And he tells endless stories of people that he met in the Gulag, in the work camps, in the death camps in the Soviet Union, of people, and this is what he learned, of people who were so incredibly tough that even under conditions, the most possible extreme conditions, there wasn't a chance that they were going to step off that straight and narrow line. There was nothing the authorities could do to move them. And just watching that was enough to transform Solzhenitsyn, because of course one of the things he wondered was, after spending a good amount of time in the work camps, was, well, just exactly how did I get here? And it wasn't, well, it was Hitler's fault and it was Stalin's fault, although it was definitely the fault of both of them. For Solzhenitsyn, it was, well, it was also his fault, because he was playing the same game. He just wasn't as good at it. And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shall thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. And so there's another message in this story, which is that it isn't only Noah and his family and human society that's dependent on Noah's appropriate actions in the world. It's the entire living planet. And in an era of excessive and extreme and genuinely disingenuous environmental catastrophizing, that's something to consider very seriously. Think, perhaps there's nothing better that you can do for everything, all things considered, including those things that are outside the confines of human society, than to get your act together and align yourself properly along all of the dimensions of your being, from the tiniest microcosm to the ultimate macrocosm, and that's the way that all of being is redeemed. That's what the story suggests. And we read it, you know, as cynical modern people, we read it as if it was written by primitive people who thought that it was really the case that someone could build a boat and put 2 of every kind into it and thereby save the world. It's embarrassing to see things interpreted in a manner that shallow, especially by people who don't have ignorance as a justification. You know, these stories have to appeal to everyone, right? And there's lots of people in the world who aren't very bright. And so they tend to take things concretely, like a child would take things concretely if you read them a story. And this story can be taken concretely. But it has to be, because these stories have to be for everyone. But if you're sophisticated, that doesn't mean that you should dismiss it as if it's written for a child. It's maybe you have the obligation to look a bit deeper and think for a moment that it wouldn't have been conserved for these many thousands of years if there wasn't something more to it than a casual intellectual dismissal would indicate.